If God is good, then why does He allow so much pain? Why do the faithful still bleed? Why do prayers sometimes go unanswered? Why do good people walk through fire, while the wicked seem untouched? It's the question whispered in hospital rooms, cried into pillows at night, screamed from broken hearts in silence. And for most of us, it's not the pain that's unbearable. It's God's silence in the middle of it. But what if His silence isn't absence? What if your suffering isn't punishment, but preparation? What if pain doesn't prove God left you, but that He's about to reveal something deeper? Job didn't suffer because he failed. He suffered because heaven knew his faith could carry fire. Heaven trusted that he would still worship when the blessings were gone and nothing made sense. Maybe you're there right now, standing in the wreckage, feeling forgotten, hearing nothing from above. But this may be the moment where your story shifts, not because you escape the pain, but because you learn to walk through it with faith that refuses to break. So stay with me. Let's talk about why God allows suffering and what He's actually building in the middle of what you're trying to survive. When the righteous bleed too. Job wasn't a rebel. He wasn't running from God. He was righteous, blameless, a man of integrity. And still, he lost everything. His children, his health, his wealth, gone in a moment. And through the silence, through the pain, he whispered, "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This is the part religion doesn't always prepare you for, that even the faithful bleed, even the obedient break, even the righteous suffer. But suffering isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's permission to be refined, permission to become something stronger. In this video, we're not just asking why pain exists, we're asking what heaven might be building through it. Let's begin. 1. Pain is not a punishment, it's a platform. One of the deepest lies people believe in moments of pain is this: I must have done something wrong. It's a natural instinct. When life falls apart, when tragedy strikes, when the prayer goes unanswered, our first thought is guilt. We think we're being punished, that God is angry, that somehow we deserve this. But that's not what Scripture shows us. Take Job. God Himself called Job blameless and upright. Not just good enough, not trying his best. God literally bragged about him to heaven and hell alike. And yet, Job is the one who suffers most. Why? Because pain in the hands of God is not about punishment. It's about purpose. God didn't allow Job to be tested because he was disobedient, but because he was trusted. That changes everything. It means your suffering may not be a reflection of your failures, but of your spiritual potential. God knew Job could carry the fire. He knew Job's faith wasn't built on comfort, but on covenant, and that's what makes pain a platform. It reveals what's really holding you up. It forces your faith out of theory and into reality, because anyone can praise when things are good. But pain is where praise becomes power. Pain strips away the shallow. Pain exposes the idols. Pain pushes you to decide, do I love God or just His blessings? And in that place, raw, real, undone, God doesn't just refine you, He reveals you. Pain can become the stage where heaven showcases your faith, where your life whispers to the world, even when I don't understand, I still trust. But let's be honest, this idea isn't easy to accept when you're in the middle of it. When you're sitting in the ashes like Job, it's hard to see the stage. You just feel the fire. That's why you need this truth buried deep. Pain may visit your life, but it doesn't define your value. You're not suffering because you're worthless. You might be suffering because you're dangerous to darkness, because your life, your worship, your trust, your obedience threatens the lies the enemy wants the world to believe. And what God is building in you through this season might be preparing a platform that reaches people you've never even met. So don't let pain shrink your faith. Let it stretch it. Don't interpret it as divine anger. See it as divine intention. Because when you understand that pain is not a prison, but a platform, you'll stop asking God to remove it too soon. You'll ask Him to use it for something that lasts. And speaking of purpose, what if your pain isn't just about you? What if you were chosen for this fire because God trusted you with something bigger? Let's talk about that next. 2. You're not being attacked. You're being trusted. Most people assume that if life is falling apart, they're under spiritual attack. And yes, sometimes that's true. But what if you're not being attacked? You're being entrusted? What if this pain, this fire, this storm you're walking through isn't a sign of God's anger, but a sign of heaven's confidence? Let's go back to Job. Satan didn't randomly target him. Job wasn't just caught in cosmic crossfire. Remember that it was God who brought Job up. God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Let that sink in. God volunteered him. God highlighted him. God said, "This one, test him, watch him, he won't fold." Why? Because God trusted what was inside of Job, even when Job didn't know it was there himself. That changes how we see pain. It's not just something you survive, it's something you carry because you're capable. It's not the enemy proving how strong he is. It's heaven proving how unshakable your faith can be. So maybe this season isn't spiritual warfare, it's spiritual promotion. God is proving something through you. Not to destroy you, but to display you. Not to weaken you, but to reveal your endurance. And maybe the silence you feel right now isn't abandonment, it's divine confidence. Because trusted warriors aren't micromanaged, they're released. God knew Job could endure the loss without losing his worship. He knew Job's faith wasn't surface level, it was forged deep. And that's the kind of faith the world needs to see today. Not the kind that only shows up on Sundays. Not the kind that disappears when things get hard, but the kind that stands firm in ashes. The kind that says, "Even if he slays me, I'll still trust him." Here's what most people miss. Satan didn't ask to test Job. God brought Job into the conversation. That means your storm may not be about the enemy targeting you. It may be about God trusting you. That hits different, because it means your pain might actually be a compliment from heaven, an indication that God sees something in you that's ready to be revealed. You're not being overlooked. You're being chosen for a kind of strength that's not loud, but legendary. And if you're thinking, "But I feel like God's gone silent," that's not a sign He's left. In fact, the silence may be more strategic than you think. Let's explore that next. 3. God's silence is still supervision. There's a moment in every believer's life when the noise fades and heaven goes quiet. You pray, and nothing happens. You cry, and the sky stays still. You fast, seek, plead, and all you hear is silence. And it's terrifying, because silence can feel like absence, like abandonment, like God left the room. But what if that silence is not neglect, but strategy? Let's go back to Job again. After losing everything, after worshiping in pain, after defending his integrity, God says nothing. Not a word, not a sign, not a whisper. For more than 30 chapters, Job speaks. His friends speak. His wife speaks. But heaven remains quiet. And yet, God was never absent. He was watching, supervising, letting Job wrestle, not to torture him, but to transform him. Because silence is where the soul grows. It's where shallow theology gets exposed, where religious cliches stop working, where your faith has to decide, do I believe because I feel God, or because I trust Him, even when I don't? We live in a culture that hates silence. We equate noise with presence. But in the kingdom, some of the most powerful moments happen in the hush. God is not a performer. He doesn't owe you constant feedback. Sometimes His silence is a compliment, a sign that He trusts your maturity. It's like a teacher during a test. They're silent, not because they're gone, but because they already gave you everything you need to pass. And that's what God did with Job. He had already prepared him, strengthened him, established him. Now, it was time to let his faith speak louder than his feelings. So if you're walking through silence right now, don't panic. Don't assume God left. Assume He's watching and waiting to reveal something greater. Because here's the truth. God does some of His best work in silence. He forges character in the quiet. He trains your spiritual ear to hear beyond volume. He deepens trust by removing constant affirmation. And if you can endure the silence, you'll come out not just stronger, but steadier, more anchored, more real. So don't confuse silence with absence. Confuse it with supervision. You're not being ignored. You're being trained. But in that silence, you still have a choice. You can fold, or you can worship anyway. Let's talk about that next. 4. Worship is warfare in the middle of wreckage. Worship feels easy when life is full. When prayers are answered, doors are open, and blessings are flowing. The praise comes naturally. But what about when everything's broken? When your hands are shaking, your heart is heavy, and nothing makes sense? Can you still lift your voice then? Job did. After losing everything, his wealth, his children, his health, he didn't curse God. He didn't retreat. He didn't fall silent. He worshiped. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's not poetic. That's warfare, because worship in that moment wasn't about feelings. It was about defiance, against despair, against darkness, against every lie that said, God's not worth it anymore. Job's worship wasn't soft. It was fierce. It was strategic. It wasn't about singing pretty songs. It was about choosing allegiance. In a world that worships comfort, control, and clarity, Job chose to worship God's character, even when he couldn't trace God's hand. And maybe that's the most powerful praise there is, the kind that rises, not in response to what God has done, but in surrender to who He is. Here's what most people miss. Worship is not the denial of pain. It's the declaration of trust within pain. It doesn't say, I feel fine. It says, I know you're still God. It's when your heart is breaking, but your mouth still says, you're worthy. That's not weakness. That's spiritual dominance. Because when you worship in the wreckage, you confuse the enemy. You remind hell that your faith isn't for sale, that even if God doesn't fix it right now, He's still good, still sovereign, still worthy. Worship in suffering is a weapon. Not just against the enemy, but against your own drift. It anchors your soul when everything else tries to pull you away. So what do? When God is silent, the pain is loud, and your future feels uncertain? You worship. You plant your feet. You lift your voice. And you say with Job, though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. Because that kind of worship doesn't just survive storms, it shifts atmospheres. And often, that's when something begins to change. Not always outside of you, but inside. But don't rush it, because what God is doing through this process takes time. And that's what we'll talk about next. 5. The process is slow because the work is deep. Let's be honest, we all love the idea of transformation. as long as it's fast. We want God to move suddenly, to heal immediately, to restore quickly, because pain makes us impatient, and waiting makes us feel forgotten. But here's the hard truth that most don't want to admit. Spiritual maturity is never microwaved. God is not in a hurry, because He's not just fixing your situation, He's forming your soul. When you ask God to take the pain away, He hears you, but sometimes He delays the relief, not because He doesn't care, but because He's doing something deeper than comfort. Let's go back to Job. His suffering didn't last an afternoon. It wasn't a 3-day spiritual fast with a breakthrough on day 4. It was a long, unrelenting stretch of silence, sorrow, and misunderstanding. No quick answers, no instant healing, no clear roadmap forward. And yet, Job remained. He stayed in the fire. He stayed in the questions. He stayed in the process. Because sometimes the most powerful act of faith is not shouting victory, but choosing not to walk away while it still hurts. God allowed the process to unfold slowly, because the goal wasn't just to restore Job's possessions, it was to reveal his real foundation. And real foundations take time. Think about building a skyscraper. The higher you want to go, the deeper you have to dig. No one sees the excavation phase. It's messy. It's loud. It looks like destruction. But it's necessary. Because if you want the structure to last, you have to go down before you go up. And that's exactly what God does with us. He allows pain to dig deep into our pride, into our false expectations, into the shallow parts of our faith, to create a space strong enough to hold what He's about to build. So if your healing is taking longer than expected, if the breakthrough you prayed for hasn't arrived, if your strength is wearing thin, and you're wondering whether God is even paying attention, hear this. Slow doesn't mean forgotten. Delayed doesn't mean denied. Sometimes the work is slow because it's sacred, because it's not about getting back to comfort. It's about becoming unshakable. This process is stripping you, not to leave you exposed, but to refine you, to teach you to rely on God in the dark, to choose surrender when nothing makes sense, to believe in promises you can't yet see. And when the process is finished, you won't just come out healed. You'll come out anchored. You'll come out with a clarity you never had before. You'll carry a kind of weight, not the weight of sorrow, but the weight of wisdom. So the next time you feel tempted to say, God, why is this taking so long? Try praying this instead. God, don't let me leave the fire too early. Finish what you started in me. Because anything that grows too fast wilts just as quickly. But what God is doing in you, it's built to last. It's not cheap. It's not rushed. It's holy. And when it's finished, you won't just recognize your own face in the mirror. You'll see God's fingerprints all over your soul. That's why we stay. That's why we wait. Because slow work is God's best work. And what's waiting on the other side of this season isn't just restoration, it's elevation. And that's what we're about to talk about next. 6. Restoration doesn't bring you back. It lifts you higher. Most people think of restoration as a return. Back to normal, back to comfort, back to how things used to be before it all fell apart. We pray, God, bring it back. Bring back the job. Bring back the relationship. Bring back the feeling I had when everything made sense. But what if God doesn't want to bring you back? What if He's not interested in your version of normal? What if His plan was never to return you to who you were, but to raise you into who you were always meant to become? Let's look at Job again. After all the chaos, after all the silence, after all the prayers, the questions, the wreckage, God restores him, but not just with what he lost. He doubles it, twice the possessions, twice the influence. Even his family is renewed. But the real restoration, it wasn't the stuff. It was the man. Job became someone new. He wasn't just wealthier, he was wiser. He wasn't just healed, he was humbled. He didn't just get through the storm, he came out with a depth he never had before. Because true restoration doesn't just give you more, it gives you perspective. It gives you a kind of stillness that can't be shaken. It gives you a reverence for God that comfort can't teach. It gives you authority, not just over blessing, but over brokenness. Here's the truth no one says enough. God doesn't restore you back to where you were. He restores you forward, beyond what you thought was possible. Because the goal was never to give you your old life back. It was to prepare you for a higher one where your voice has weight, where your scars carry wisdom, where your faith is no longer theoretical, it's battle-tested. That's what happens when you walk through fire and don't run. You emerge with a different kind of presence. People feel it. The room shifts, not because you're louder, but because you're anchored. And here's what's even more powerful. Job's story didn't just bless him, it blessed generations. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about him. Not because he avoided pain, but because he remained faithful through it. That's the kind of restoration God's aiming for. Not just healing you, but making you a blueprint for others. So if you're in a season of loss and you're praying for God to just put things back the way they were, I get it. That's human. But maybe God is saying, I have something better, not easier, not familiar, but higher. You're not being reset. You're being rebuilt. And when God rebuilds you, He uses the rubble of your past to construct a foundation you can finally stand on. So no, restoration isn't about going back. It's about going up. And once you've been through the kind of fire you're walking through now, you won't even want to go back. Because you'll know that version of me couldn't carry what I'm about to receive. And that makes it worth it. So let this be the truth you carry. What you lost was real. But what's ahead is greater. You are not being repaired. You are being elevated. And if you hold on a little longer, you'll see that for yourself. Now let's land this journey, because what you've just walked through has prepared you to carry something bigger than you ever expected. The fire you walk through today will light the way for others. By now you've seen it. That pain isn't random. Suffering isn't punishment. And the silence of God is never the same as His absence. If anything, it might be a sacred setup for something deeper. Let's go back and remember the 6 truths that reframed this entire journey. 1. Pain is not a punishment. It's a platform. You're not cursed. You're being called into something higher. 2. You're not being attacked. You're being trusted. Heaven has placed a divine confidence in you. God volunteers warriors, not victims. 3. God's silence is still supervision. Just because He's quiet doesn't mean He's not watching, guiding, refining. 4. Worship is warfare in the middle of wreckage. When you raise your voice through the tears, you shake spiritual realms. 5. The process is slow because the work is deep. God is not trying to get you back to normal. He's forming something eternal in you. 6. Restoration doesn't bring you back. It lifts you higher. Your best days aren't behind you. They're waiting just beyond this valley, maybe right now. You're still in the middle. You're still waiting, still aching, still wondering, how long, Lord? I can't answer that, but I can promise this. God is not wasting your pain. Every tear you've cried is being collected. Every moment you've chosen to stay faithful, when it would have been easier to walk away, has been seen, not by people, but by the one who matters most. And maybe, just maybe, your story, your scars, your endurance, they're not just about you. Maybe someone else is going to survive. Because you didn't quit, maybe your fire will become their light. Because here's the truth. God never wastes a broken heart. that's still beating for him. He never wastes a wilderness. That keeps walking toward him. And he never, ever forgets. A soul that chose to worship when it had every reason not to. So, here's the final word I want to leave with you. You are not forgotten. You are being forged. And what comes next will be worth what it took to get here. Hold on. Stay in the fire. Let it purify you, not burn you out, because one day you'll look back at the ashes and realize, this is where I became real. This is where I became strong. This is where I met God. Not in theory, but in fire. Drop a comment below. Even in pain, I will still trust Him. Subscribe for more spiritual clarity, especially when life feels cloudy. Share this video with someone silently struggling. Let them know they're not alone and they're not forgotten. Because the fire you're in today might be the reason someone else finds light tomorrow.